The moment my life changed wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no fireworks, no champagne corks popping, no cheering crowd. It was just me, in my small apartment, sitting cross-legged on the couch, with my phone in one hand and a crumpled lottery ticket in the other. 6 numbers. That was all it took. 3, 16, 12, 21, 9, 30. Each one matching the glowing numbers on the lottery website like a cruel trick my eyes were playing. My first thought was that I had read them wrong. My second thought was that I had read them wrong again. By the 5th double check, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the ticket. $47 million. That's what the website said I'd won. After taxes, it would be closer to $28 million. Still, more money than I had ever dared to imagine in my entire life. For a woman who had been calculating whether she could afford a $4 latte the day before, this was a seismic shift. But instead of screaming or calling the people closest to me, an entirely different thought took root in my mind. Cold, deliberate, and almost instinctive. I'm not telling a soul, not my parents, not my brother or sister, not even my best friend, Charlotte. Because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. My history with my family had been a long string of loans that were never paid back, emergencies that somehow turned into vacations or luxury purchases, and guilt trips that drained my savings as quickly as any bill collector could. Money had always been a weapon in my family, sometimes wielded to control, sometimes to shame, and often to take advantage. This money could change my life, but it could just as easily destroy it. I had read the horror stories about lottery winners who went bankrupt, who were hounded by family and friends, who lost everything because they couldn't say no. I wasn't going to be one of them. So I made a decision right then. I would claim my winnings quietly, under a legal trust, and live my life as if nothing had changed, at least for now. Outwardly, I'd still be the overworked accountant with the second-hand furniture and the 10-year-old car. Inwardly, I'd be the woman with the kind of financial security most people never dream of. It was a strange, almost intoxicating secret to hold. The freedom was exhilarating. The isolation, less so. Because once the initial thrill faded, an uneasy question began to take shape in my mind. If no one knew I had this money, who in my life would still be there for me when I had nothing to give? That question, as it turned out, would set everything else in motion. Before those 6 numbers lined up in my favor, my life could be summed up in one word: ordinary. Not terrible, not glamorous, just an endless cycle of routine. I was 34 years old, single, and working as an accountant at a small marketing firm in Portland. It wasn't the kind of job that impressed anyone at parties, but it paid enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional night out. The problem was, it didn't pay enough to feel safe. Every month felt like a balancing act. One unexpected car repair, one medical bill, one too large utility payment, and the whole system would wobble. My apartment was a modest 1-bedroom on the outskirts of the city. The building was old enough that the plumbing made strange noises at night, but it was mine. I'd thrifted most of my furniture and learned how to make a mismatched space feel like home. My 10-year-old Corolla groaned every time it rained, but it still got me to work, for now. My mornings were a blur of coffee, emails, and the quiet calculation of how much I could spend that week. Afternoons bled into evenings of spreadsheets, client calls, and cleaning up the messes my coworkers left behind. 60-hour weeks weren't unusual, especially during tax season. I told myself the grind would pay off someday, but someday always seemed to move further away. And then there was my family, a complicated web of half-siblings, remarriages, and strained politeness. My parents had divorced when I was 14. My dad, Gregory, a high school physics teacher, remarried Stephanie, a real estate agent with a taste for luxury she couldn't quite afford. My mom, Diane, married Warren, a successful businessman whose money came with strings and conditions. I had 2 siblings. Lisa, my younger sister, was the golden child, Ivy League degree, married to a surgeon, living in a magazine-worthy suburban home with 2 perfectly dressed kids. Jason, my older brother, had charm to spare, but no steady job, hopping between relationships and hustles. He'd turned borrowing money into an art form, urgent calls, heartfelt promises, and then silence until the next crisis. I'd learned the hard way that in my family, generosity was a one-way street. When Jason needed $5,000 for rehab, I drained my savings, only to find out later he'd never gone. When Lisa wanted help paying for her wedding, I put $2,000 on my credit card. 5 years later, I was still waiting to be paid back. Even my dad had borrowed from me once for a roof repair, then posted vacation photos from Cancun a month later. It wasn't just my immediate family either. My Aunt Heather, my dad's sister, loved to flaunt her wealthy lifestyle while making cutting remarks about my single status. Her son, Ryan, had inherited her entitlement, but none of her money, plus a gambling habit the family politely ignored. The only person who ever gave without expecting something in return was my Aunt Martha, my mom's younger sister, a public school teacher who lived paycheck to paycheck, drove a beat-up Honda, and somehow always showed up when it mattered. Money was always an unspoken undercurrent in our relationships, a tool for leverage, a source of guilt, a reason for grudges. I had spent years being the reliable one, the one who picked up the slack, the one who lent money even when it hurt. It was a role I'd taken on without question, until the night I held a winning lottery ticket in my hands. Before that night, my dreams were small and practical. I wanted to travel, but not extravagantly, just enough to see places beyond the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to go back to school, maybe get a degree in something I actually cared about. I wanted an emergency fund big enough to make a surprise expense an inconvenience, not a crisis. Those dreams felt impossibly far away when I was still chipping away at student loans and juggling credit card payments. But I kept them tucked away, a quiet list of someday goals. I didn't know it then, but the moment I decided to keep my fortune a secret, those dreams would change, not just in scope, but in meaning. Because having money would force me to see my life, my family, and my own boundaries in a way I had never dared to before. If you really want to understand why I chose to keep my lottery win a secret, you have to understand the history I had with my family, and how, in our world, money was rarely just money. It was leverage. It was a scorecard. It was a silent contract that usually benefited only one side. The story goes back to my teenage years, when my parents' divorce split not just our household, but our loyalties. My father, Gregory, remarried quickly to Stephanie, a polished, image-conscious real estate agent who had an eye for designer handbags and a calendar full of networking lunches at expensive restaurants. She treated her lifestyle as an extension of her brand, and my father, a quiet high school physics teacher, seemed to go along with it. My mother, Diane, remarried Warren 2 years later. Warren was the opposite of my father, successful, controlling, and deliberate with every dollar he spent. He had no children of his own, and although he was cordial to me and my siblings, he made it very clear his money was for my mother and any future children they might have. Since they never had kids together, that meant his generosity toward me was, let's just say, limited. Then there were my siblings. Lisa, my younger sister, had been the star since we were kids. She was beautiful, driven, and knew exactly how to charm people, including our parents. She attended an Ivy League school, married a surgeon named Paul, and settled into a picture-perfect life in the suburbs. When she needed help with her wedding expenses, I stepped in with $2,000 on my credit card because it would mean so much to her. She promised to pay me back after the honeymoon. It's been years. I'm still waiting. Jason, my older brother, had the opposite trajectory. He was smart and charismatic, but allergic to stability. He jumped from job to job, relationship to relationship, and every few months seemed to have a new, big opportunity that required cash to get off the ground. 3 years ago, he called me in tears, saying he needed $5,000 for rehab. I emptied my savings account without hesitation, only to learn months later that he never actually went. By then, the money was long gone. It wasn't just them. My dad once asked me for a small loan to help repair his roof after a storm. I gave him what I could, only to see photos of him and Stephanie on a beach in Cancun weeks later. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said the trip had been booked months before, as if that made it better. My extended family wasn't much different. Aunt Heather, my father's sister, was the kind of person who never forgot to remind you of your shortcomings, often under the guise of just being honest. She had married into money, and she wore her wealth like armor. Her son Ryan, my cousin, had inherited her entitlement without any of her financial stability. He had a gambling problem everyone pretended not to see, and more than once I'd been the one to cover his bad luck streaks. The only exception the single person in my entire family who had never treated me like a bank or a backup plan, was my Aunt Martha. She was my mom's younger sister, a public school teacher living in a tiny apartment filled with books and plants. She didn't have much, but what she had, she shared. She'd drive hours to help me move apartments, show up with soup when I was sick, and remember every important date in my life. She was, in every sense of the word, genuine. Still, even with Martha's kindness, my trust in the family as a whole had eroded. Too many loans that were never repaid. Too many instances of my generosity being met with silence or excuses. I'd learned to say yes even when it hurt me, because that's what was expected. And every time I gave, the unspoken message was the same. You're responsible for fixing other people's messes, but don't expect anyone to fix yours. So when that winning ticket landed in my lap, the choice to keep it secret wasn't paranoia, it was self-preservation. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. If I told them, the money wouldn't bring us closer. It would turn me into a target. What I didn't know yet was that I was about to prove it, in a way that would leave no doubt. The night I realized I'd won, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, tumbling down a rabbit hole of what happens when you win the lottery stories. It wasn't the luxury mansions or yachts that caught my attention. It was the cautionary tales. People who had won millions only to be bankrupt within 5 years. Families torn apart by jealousy and greed. Childhood friends appearing out of nowhere with can't-miss business opportunities. Distant cousins suddenly remembering your birthday when they never had before. One headline burned into my mind: winning the lottery, the fastest way to lose everyone you care about. By sunrise, my decision was made. If I wanted to protect my sanity, my relationships, and my future, I couldn't tell anyone, not yet. That morning, I called in sick to work, the first time in 3 years, and made an appointment with a lawyer named Philip Montgomery. His office was in a sleek downtown building that felt far removed from my usual world. Sitting in that waiting room with my worn purse and the winning ticket tucked inside, I felt like an imposter. Philip was calm, direct, and unshakably professional. I slid the ticket across his polished desk and said the words I'd been turning over in my mind all night. I need to claim this without anyone knowing it's me. He didn't flinch. Instead, he explained the options. In our state, lottery winners could claim their prize through a trust, shielding their name from public record. He laid out the process. Set up a blind trust, consult with a tax specialist, and build a team of financial advisors before spending a cent. The biggest mistake winners make, he told me, is telling too many people too quickly. Once that happens, there's no going back. I left his office with a folder of documents, a list of next steps, and the sobering realization that I now had the power to reshape my life, and the burden of doing it alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Philip and I worked quietly. We established the trust, claimed the winnings, and secured the funds in a diverse portfolio of investments. On paper, nothing in my life changed. I still drove my beat-up Corolla. I still clocked in at my accounting job. I still clipped coupons at the grocery store. But every night, I came home knowing I had enough money to never work another day in my life. Enough to travel anywhere. Enough to erase every financial fear I'd ever had. And yet, a question gnawed at me. If no one knew I had this fortune, who would stand by me when I had nothing? I decided there was only one way to find out. I was going to test my family, and the results would decide who, if anyone, I would let into my new life. Once I committed to the idea, the plan formed quickly, almost too easily. If I wanted to know who truly cared about me, I couldn't simply wait for a crisis to appear. I had to create one, something believable, something that would test their willingness to help without the promise of any reward. I decided I would tell each family member the same story. The small marketing firm where I worked had suddenly shut down after losing its biggest clients. The closure had been abrupt, leaving me without a final paycheck. I was in a financial bind and needed $5,000 to cover rent and medical bills until I found a new job. The amount was deliberate. It wasn't pocket change, but it also wasn't astronomical, well within reach for most of them, especially considering what I had done for them in the past. To make the story airtight, I started building out the details. The CEO had been caught embezzling funds, and the company was under investigation. The job market was tight, especially for specialized accounting roles. I had a few interviews lined up, but nothing definite. My emergency fund had been drained by recent medical tests for concerning symptoms, vague enough to spark sympathy, but not so specific that I'd have to fabricate elaborate lies, i.e., then practice telling it in a way that sounded distressed, but not desperate. I wanted to see genuine willingness, not a reaction to panic. Charlotte, my best friend, was the only person I confided in, though not about the lottery win, only about the experiment. When I laid out my plan, she looked at me like I'd just told her I was moving to the moon. "Cassie, this seems manipulative," she said, frowning. "Why not just have honest conversations with them about how you feel?" I laughed, but without humor. "Because you've seen how my family communicates. We don't do honest. We do guilt trips, deflection, and excuses." She shook her head but sighed. "Fine. If you're going to do this, at least do it right. Have specific answers ready for their questions. Keep your story consistent." Her reluctant support was enough for me to keep going. That night, I sat down with a notepad and made my prediction list. Mom, Diane, she'd express concern but ultimately pass responsibility to someone else, probably Warren. Dad, Gregory, lecture about financial responsibility, maybe send a token amount. Lisa, say she couldn't help because of the kids' expenses. Jason, claim he had no money, avoid my calls. Warren Stephanie, refuse outright. Aunt Heather, judge my choices, offer no help. Cousin Ryan, promise assistance, then vanish. Aunt Martha, the only one I expected might actually help, even if she couldn't give much. The list didn't just reflect my doubts. It was a map of our family dynamics. Every past favor, every broken promise, every excuse they'd given me was baked into my expectations. Still, I tried to temper my assumptions. Maybe I'd be surprised. Maybe someone would step up. The rules of the test were simple. I'd approach them one by one, tell them my story, and see how they responded. No bargaining, no shaming, just a straightforward request for help. What they didn't know was that this was more than a test. It was a filter. Whoever passed would be the only ones I considered bringing into the truth of my new life. Whoever failed, well, they'd never know what they'd lost. I didn't realize it then, but this plan wasn't just about trust. It was about giving myself permission to stop carrying the weight of people who wouldn't carry me. And with that, I picked up my phone and made the first call. I decided to start with my mother. Mom had always prided herself on being the nurturing parent, the one who sacrificed her own dreams to raise us. If anyone would step up, I told myself, it would be her. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Hi, Mom," I said, letting a note of strain slip into my voice. "Cassie, you sound upset. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and delivered the story I'd rehearsed. The company's sudden closure, the lost paycheck, the medical expenses. I kept my voice steady, but added small pauses to make it sound natural. "Oh, honey, that's terrible," she said when I finished. "Have you applied for unemployment? What about your emergency fund?" I explained that unemployment would take weeks and my savings had been depleted by the medical tests. Then I added the line that mattered most. "I hate to ask, Mom, but I need help. About $5,000 to cover rent and bills until I can find something new. I promise I'll pay you back." There was a long pause. "Oh, Cassie, you know Warren and I just put a down payment on the lake house. We're pretty cash poor right now. Have you tried asking your father or Lisa? Paul makes good money." I swallowed the knot in my throat. I was hoping to avoid asking Dad, and Lisa has the kids' tuition. "Well, let me talk to Warren and see what we can do," she said finally. "But I can't promise anything. You know how tight he is with money." I did know, which was why I didn't expect to hear from her again, and I was right. The next day I met my father, for coffee. I'd picked a public place thinking it might temper his reaction. "You look tired," he said by way of greeting. Charlotte, my best friend, was the only person I confided in, though not about the lottery win, only about the experiment. When I laid out my plan, she looked at me like I'd just told her I was moving to the moon. "Cassie, this seems manipulative," she said, frowning. "Why not just have honest conversations with them about how you feel?" I laughed, but without humor. "Because you've seen how my family communicates. We don't do honest. We do guilt trips, deflection, and excuses." She shook her head but sighed. Fine. If you're going to do this, at least do it right. Have specific answers ready for their questions. Keep your story consistent. Her reluctant support was enough for me to keep going. That night, I sat down with a notepad and made my prediction list. Mom, Diane, she'd express concern but ultimately pass responsibility to someone else, probably Warren. Dad, Gregory, lecture about financial responsibility, maybe send a token amount. Lisa, say she couldn't help because of the kids' expenses. Jason, claim he had no money, avoid my calls. Warren Stephanie, refuse outright. Aunt Heather, judge my choices, offer no help. Cousin Ryan, promise assistance, then vanish. Aunt Martha, the only one I expected might actually help, even if she couldn't give much. The list didn't just reflect my doubts. It was a map of our family dynamics. Every past favor, every broken promise, every excuse they'd given me was baked into my expectations. Still, I tried to temper my assumptions. Maybe I'd be surprised. Maybe someone would step up. The rules of the test were simple. I'd approach them one by one, tell them my story, and see how they responded. No bargaining, no shaming, just a straightforward request for help. What they didn't know was that this was more than a test. It was a filter. Whoever passed would be the only ones I considered bringing into the truth of my new life. Whoever failed, well, they'd never know what they'd lost. I didn't realize it then, but this plan wasn't just about trust. It was about giving myself permission to stop carrying the weight of people who wouldn't carry me. And with that, I picked up my phone and made the first call. I decided to start with my mother. Mom had always prided herself on being the nurturing parent, the one who sacrificed her own dreams to raise us. If anyone would step up, I told myself, it would be her. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Hi, Mom," I said, letting a note of strain slip into my voice. "Cassie, you sound upset. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and delivered the story I'd rehearsed. The company's sudden closure, the lost paycheck, the medical expenses. I kept my voice steady, but added small pauses to make it sound natural. "Oh, honey, that's terrible," she said when I finished. "Have you applied for unemployment? What about your emergency fund?" I explained that unemployment would take weeks and my savings had been depleted by the medical tests. Then I added the line that mattered most. "I hate to ask, Mom, but I need help. About $5,000 to cover rent and bills until I can find something new. I promise I'll pay you back." There was a long pause. "Oh, Cassie, you know Warren and I just put a down payment on the lake house. We're pretty cash poor right now. Have you tried asking your father or Lisa? Paul makes good money." I swallowed the knot in my throat. I was hoping to avoid asking Dad, and Lisa has the kids' tuition. "Well, let me talk to Warren and see what we can do," she said finally. "But I can't promise anything. You know how tight he is with money." I did know, which was why I didn't expect to hear from her again, and I was right. The next day I met my father, for coffee. I'd picked a public place thinking it might temper his reaction. "You look tired," he said by way of greeting. I smiled weakly and launched into my story. He listened, face impassive, and when I mentioned the $5,000, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "Cassandra, I've always told you to keep 6 months' expenses saved," he began in his teacher voice. "This is exactly why." "Life happened, Dad," I replied evenly. He sighed. "And now you expect others to bail you out. Stephanie and I are focused on our retirement. We can't dip into those funds. It wouldn't be responsible." Not once did he offer even a token amount. Instead, he patted my hand and told me it would be a good learning experience. Lisa was next. I drove to her immaculate suburban home on a Saturday afternoon. "Oh my God, that's awful," she said, squeezing my hand across the marble kitchen island. I felt a flicker of hope until I mentioned the amount. Her face shifted. "Well, we just bought the new Audi, and the kids' tuition was due. Plus, we're redoing the master bath. Paul's strict about our budget." "I understand," I said. "Let me talk to him. Maybe we could help with a smaller amount. Or you could move in with us for a while." I thanked her but declined. The call she promised never came. Jason's response was the shortest of all. I texted him the situation in detail. He replied, "That sucks, sis. Really tight right now myself. We'll call you later." He never did. My stepmother, Stephanie, skipped any pretense of sympathy. "I'm sorry, Cassandra, but Warren and I aren't in a position to help. Maybe this is an opportunity to learn better financial management. Have you considered a roommate?" I reminded her I'd once helped them pay for cabin repairs. She bristled. "That was different. That was a family property you enjoy too." I'd been invited to that cabin exactly once in 5 years. Warren's response was colder. "You're not my daughter. Your financial problems are your own. Perhaps you should have chosen a more lucrative career." Cousin Ryan initially sounded sympathetic, even offering to meet for lunch to give me a check. An hour before, he canceled. Something came up. He never rescheduled. Aunt Heather's call was the least surprising. "Well, Cassandra, I always said your company seemed unstable. I told your father you should have taken that job at the bank. Other family members have had troubles too, but they didn't beg for handouts." By that evening, Lisa told me Aunt Heather had been gossiping about my financial irresponsibility to the rest of the family. By the end of the week, I was drained. 7 people I had helped, sometimes at my own expense, had either refused, made excuses, or disappeared. Then my phone rang. It was Aunt Martha. "Cassie, honey, I just heard from your mother about your job. Are you okay?" I hadn't even reached out to her yet. She'd called me first. "I'm hanging in there," I said, and this time, the emotion in my voice wasn't part of the act. "Let's do lunch tomorrow. My treat." She didn't ask for proof. She didn't hesitate. She just showed up, like she always had. And I had no idea yet how far her generosity was about to go. When I arrived at the little diner near Aunt Martha's apartment the next day, she was already there, waving from a corner booth. She looked exactly as she always did. Silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail, jeans, and a cardigan with mismatched buttons. There was no pretension about her, no sense of performance. The moment I slid into the seat across from her, she reached over and hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry about your job, sweetheart. That company never deserved you anyway. We ordered coffee and simple breakfasts." She didn't launch into advice or judgment. Instead, she asked questions, the kind that showed she was actually listening. "What's the market like right now for accounting jobs? Have you thought about what kind of work you really want to do next? Do you need me to connect you with anyone I know?" It wasn't pity. It was genuine concern. When the plates were cleared, she reached into her worn purse and pulled out an envelope. "I want you to take this," she said, sliding it across the table. I hesitated. "Martha, I can't—" "It's $3,000, she interrupted. "I know it's not the full amount that you said you needed, but it'll help with your rent, at least. Family helps family. That's how it should be." I stared at her. "This is too much." She shook her head. "And if you need a place to stay to save on rent, my sofa pulls out into a bed. It's not fancy, but it's yours as long as you need it." That was when the tears came, and for the first time since this experiment began, they weren't part of the act. I thanked her over and over, my voice breaking. She waved it off. "Don't you worry about paying me back right away. Get back on your feet first, and maybe this time, find a job where people appreciate you. Life's too short for anything else." After lunch, I drove home with the envelope in my lap. $3,000, more than I knew she could comfortably spare. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I did some quiet digging and learned something that hit me like a punch. $3,000 was nearly all of her savings. She'd been dealing with complications from type 2 diabetes, and her medication costs had gone up. To cover them, she'd been picking up extra tutoring work after school. And still, without hesitation, she'd offered me almost everything she had. I thought about my mother, who'd just bought an $8,000 bathroom renovation. Lisa, who'd replaced her perfectly fine car with a new Audi. My father, who claimed he couldn't dip into his retirement. All of them had more than Martha. And none of them had lifted a finger. But Martha, with the least to give, had given the most. That night, I knew 2 things for certain. She was the only one who had truly passed my test. I couldn't keep lying to her. The next time we met, I was going to tell her the truth. All of it. I invited Martha over for dinner a few nights later. She arrived carrying a small bouquet of daisies from the corner store, her way of brightening up my space without spending much. As she settled into my worn couch, I handed her a cup of tea and tried to quiet the nervous pounding in my chest. "Martha," I began, "there's something I need to tell you. I haven't been completely honest." Her brow furrowed slightly, but her eyes stayed warm. "What is it, honey?" "I didn't lose my job. The company's fine. I still work there." The words tumbled out faster now. "I made up the story to see who in the family would help me if I needed it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I see." "Are you angry with me?" I asked, suddenly terrified of losing the one relationship that felt real. "Not angry," she said finally. "Sad, maybe. Sad that you felt you had to test people this way. But I understand why you did it. Our family hasn't always been kind to you." "You were the only one who offered to help," I told her. "Everyone else had excuses or just ignored me." Martha sighed. "People show you who they are when giving becomes inconvenient. I learned that a long time ago." When I asked what she meant, she told me about her ex-husband, Robert, how she'd inherited $50,000 from her grandmother, not a fortune, but enough to change their lives, and wanted to save it for a house. How Robert had forged her signature to invest in a friend's doomed restaurant, how it ended their marriage. "It taught me something," she said. "Money doesn't just reveal who others are. It reveals who we are, too, how we use it, how we share it, how we talk about it." Her words sank in deeper than she could have known, which is why I decided it was time to tell her everything. "Martha, I won the lottery 3 weeks ago, 47 million dollars." Her eyes widened, but she didn't gasp or cover her mouth. She just waited. "I haven't told anyone else, not my parents, not Lisa or Jason, not even Charlotte. You're the first." "Oh, Cassie," she said softly, "that's life-changing." "I know, and I wanted to know who'd be there for me without knowing about the money. You were the only one." She reached for my hand. "I don't need anything from you, sweetheart. I'm happy with my life. Just knowing you're secure and happy is enough for me." And I believed her. By the time I called the family meeting, the decision was made. I wasn't telling them about the lottery. Not now. Maybe not ever. Still, I couldn't let the whole thing fade into silence. The week I'd spent making calls, sending texts, and hearing excuses had left a pit in my stomach. Not just from the rejection, but from the way they'd twisted my request into a flaw in my character. I needed to look them in the eye and tell them, plainly, what that week had shown me. I told them I had an important announcement and invited them to my apartment on Sunday. To my surprise, they all came. My mother and Warren arrived first, carrying the faint air of people expecting bad news they'd have to manage. My father and Stephanie followed, then Lisa and Paul, Jason, and even Aunt Heather. Aunt Martha was last, giving me a knowing, supportive smile as she stepped inside. I stood in my small living room, the air thick with curiosity and wariness. "Thank you for coming," I began. "I know there have been rumors about my financial situation. I wanted to address them directly." My mother shifted in her seat. Jason glanced at his phone. Lisa crossed her legs and smoothed her dress. "The truth is, I'm fine. I've found a new job with better pay and benefits, and I'll be transitioning to it next month. Technically true, I'd just appointed myself as the executive director of my soon-to-launch nonprofit." Relief spread across a few faces. They had come expecting to be asked for money again, or to stage some kind of intervention. This was better news. "So why?" my father asked. "Did you ask everyone for help if you had a job lined up?" His tone was sharp, accusatory. "Because when I thought I was in trouble, I reached out to my family," I said evenly. "That's what family is supposed to be for, right?" An uncomfortable silence followed. "Well, we all have our own financial commitments," Stephanie said quickly. "It's not always possible to help, even when we want to." "Of course," I agreed. "We all have to make choices about our priorities." I turned to Jason. "Speaking of which, I noticed you never responded to my messages. This from the same brother who asked me for $3,000 last Christmas to cover your rent." Jason looked down. "I didn't have anything to give." "A phone call doesn't cost anything," I replied. The meeting continued in that pattern, me calmly pointing out where they had fallen short when I'd reached out, them offering excuses or deflecting. Lisa said the timing had been bad. My mother claimed Warren had been looking into their finances to see if they could help. Aunt Heather insisted she was simply being realistic about my situation. No one admitted wrongdoing, no one apologized. And I didn't push for either. That wasn't the point. When the hour was over, they filed out with the stiff politeness of people eager to leave an uncomfortable conversation behind. I could tell they were already reshaping the narrative in their heads, turning it into another story about how difficult I could be. But as the door closed, I felt lighter than I had in years. Martha stayed behind to help me clear coffee cups and plates. "You did well," she said quietly. "It was easier than I thought it would be," I admitted. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of disappointing them. I realized their opinion of me was never based on who I really am. She smiled, a glint of pride in her eyes. "That's a powerful realization." She was Rig. HUT. It wasn't about changing them. It was about finally seeing them clearly and deciding once and for all where they belonged in my life. With the family meeting behind me, I could finally focus on the future, the one I actually wanted, not the one I'd been cornered into living for years. The first step was taking care of Martha. I met with Philip, my lawyer, and explained exactly what I wanted: a trust that would cover her medical expenses and provide her with a comfortable retirement. But it had to be done in a way that felt like a gift, not charity. Martha was proud. I didn't want her to feel indebted or diminished. Philip suggested structuring it as a family trust with a monthly stipend, so she wouldn't have to manage a lump sum. I also decided I'd buy her a modest single-story home near wherever I chose to live, something accessible for the days her diabetes made walking difficult, but warm and full of light, the kind of place she could truly make her own. Next came my own living situation. I didn't want a mansion or anything that screamed wealth. I found a beautiful but modest home in a quiet neighborhood, a place with a garden where I could drink my coffee in the mornings without the constant hum of city traffic. It wasn't about showing off. It was about creating peace. The bigger vision, though, was the nonprofit. Martha's generosity, given despite her own struggles, had lit a fire in me. I wanted to create an organization that would support elderly people living alone, especially those estranged from their families, with companionship, home repairs, and financial assistance. Too many people like Martha gave and gave without ever getting that same care in return. I stepped away from my accounting job and appointed myself executive director. I gave myself a modest salary, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly, and used the rest of my resources to get the nonprofit off the ground. We hired a small but passionate team, including Charlotte, who became our outreach coordinator. Her nursing background and empathy made her perfect for the role. Within the first year, we'd already helped over 200 seniors in the city. Some needed a leaking roof patched, some just needed someone to listen over a cup of tea, and every time I saw our volunteers show up for someone who'd felt forgotten, I thought of Martha, of how one selfless act had inspired so much. My relationship with the rest of my family shifted into something distant but functional. Polite calls on birthdays, holiday gatherings stripped of the illusion of closeness. They believed I'd simply found success with my new career in nonprofit management, and none of them pressed for details. That told me all I needed to know about how deeply they were really interested in my life. I'd expected some pang of guilt at keeping my winning secret, but instead, I felt steady, grounded. For the first time, my boundaries were intact, and my choices weren't shaped by fear of disappointing anyone. I wasn't just building a new life. I was building one I could live in without compromise. Even with the distance I'd placed between myself and most of my family, I couldn't ignore it when real hardship came their way. The difference now was that I could choose how to help, quietly, on my own terms, without opening the door for manipulation. When my father had a minor heart attack and was facing steep medical bills, I made an anonymous payment through the hospital's patient assistance program. He never knew it was me. He just told me later that someone up there must have been looking out for him. When my cousin Ryan finally entered rehab for his gambling addiction, I anonymously covered the cost of his treatment. He completed the program and, for the first time in years, seemed genuinely hopeful about the future. He sent a group text thanking whoever helped make this possible. I didn't respond. There were other moments, too. A friend of Martha's whose apartment needed urgent repairs after a storm. A former coworker whose car broke down just weeks before she was set to start a new job. Small interventions, carefully planned, that made a tangible difference without inviting attention. I realized I liked it this way. Without my name attached, the help stayed pure. No gratitude owed, no expectations set. It wasn't about recognition. It was about restoring balance, putting good back into the world, in places where it might matter most. Even with these quiet acts, my boundaries stayed firm. I didn't rush to answer every family text. I didn't offer help unless it was truly needed. And I didn't step in for luxuries disguised as emergencies. Lisa's complaints about the cost of her kitchen renovation didn't earn a dime from me. Jason's pitch for a can't-miss business venture went unanswered. Martha, of course, knew about every act of kindness, even if the recipients didn't. We'd talk about them over dinner, and she'd smile that knowing smile. "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones no one knows came from you," she'd say. And she was right. These small, secret gestures gave me a quiet kind of fulfillment. The opposite of the chaos I'd imagined when I first read those stories about lottery winners who lost everything. My wealth wasn't a magnet for drama because I never let it become a performance. The money gave me freedom. The secrecy gave me peace. 1 year after those winning numbers changed my life, I could see the whole journey with a clarity I didn't have at the start. When I first decided to keep the lottery win a secret, it was out of fear. Fear of being used, fear of watching relationships crumble under the weight of money, fear of becoming just a bank account with a pulse. I thought I was protecting the money from my family. What I didn't realize was that I was protecting myself from the illusions I'd been living under for years. Because the truth is, the money didn't change anyone. It didn't turn the selfish into givers or the careless into caretakers. It just revealed who they already were. Those who made excuses when I asked for help had been making excuses all along. Those who turned away in my moment of need were never going to stand by me in harder times. And then there was Martha, the one person who had every reason to say she couldn't help, but did anyway, without hesitation, without conditions, without knowing I had millions tucked away in a trust. She taught me that real love doesn't keep a balance sheet. It doesn't give with the expectation of return. But it also respects boundaries. It's steady in good times and bad, and it doesn't shift depending on what you have to offer. Before the lottery, I'd spent years trying to earn love by being the one who always showed up, who always gave, who always fixed things. I thought that was what family meant, sacrificing, even when it hurt. Now, I understood that love built on obligation isn't love at all. My life now was rich in ways that had nothing to do with my bank account. I had a home that brought me peace, a nonprofit that gave my days purpose, and a relationship with Martha and Charlotte that reminded me what genuine connection feels like. I had boundaries, and I kept them. And I had peace, the kind that comes from knowing I'm no longer in the business of buying people's approval or affection. There were moments when I was tempted to reveal the truth, when Jason complained about not being able to afford something he wanted, when Lisa sighed about how expensive private school had become. In those moments, I would think about telling them, about watching their faces shift as the reality sank in. But then I'd remember the silence when I'd asked for help. I'd remember how quickly they'd moved on, how easily they'd judged, and the urge would pass. Martha put it best one evening as we sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know," she said, "if you'd told everyone right away, they would have acted differently, kinder, more attentive, but you would never have known what was real." She was right. The knowledge, painful as it was, had given me freedom. The greatest gift I got from winning the lottery wasn't financial security. It was the understanding that the people who deserve a place in your life are the ones who stay when you have nothing to offer but yourself. So I'll ask you the same question I had to answer for myself. Have you ever had to test someone's loyalty? And if you did, what did you learn? Share your story. Someone might need to hear it.